So are there any open questions? Please.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for pioneering. I think it's a very difficult topic you're covering. So I'm trying to understand the SPV you're actually investing in. You're buying a token representing a share of the SPV, and who's taking the liability in that case? Is it Bitbond GmbH? Who's the managing director? Where is it like hosted? These kind of questions.
Sure. I'll just repeat the question for everybody. So the question is, if I understand it correctly, what is the SPV that's issuing the Bitbond token?
Who's taking the liability, like who's the managing director?
Okay. And then, so who's taking the liability towards the investors? So to give a bit more insights about that, we have at Bitbond we founded a subsidiary company which is the issuer of the BB1 token. And we've done that because this is a very simple type of company. It does two things. On the one hand, it's the issuer of the BB1 token, so it raises money from the token offering. And then what it does with the proceeds is it investing most of those funds into SME loans on the Bitbond platform. So it almost operates like a specialty bank. It refinances itself in the public market and invests the money into SME loans on the Bitbond platform. And we wanted to ring fence the portfolio from other operations of Bitbond, which is one of the main reasons why we have founded a subsidiary for it. What the token holders actually have is a claim towards the issuer entity, right? So this is from a legal standpoint, it's a bond which has to be repaid after 10 years, so that's the lifetime of the bond. And the liability is simply towards the token holders. Ultimately, the assets that are underpinning the issuance are the SME loans that the issuer entity holds as assets in its balance sheet. So while there is no direct relationship between the token holder and the SME loans, at the end of the day, the performance of the SME loans portfolio that gets invested into determines the performance of the token. In terms of managing directors, our CFO Michael Pincus, who's here today, and myself, we are managing directors in both the issuer entity and Bitbond GmbH, the parent company. Which, if you look into the prospectus, is also transparently described there. We believe it's a good setup because obviously we have a lot of knowledge about the issuer and the parent company. At some point it might be thinkable, I mean, we're calling the BB1 token BB1 token for a reason. We're planning to do further issuances in the future, and it might be thinkable to set up a very similar type of SPV with a third-party independent director, for example. But since this was our first issuance, we felt like it makes sense that the people who have the most insider knowledge about, I would say, the whole setup are also the managing directors of that entity.
My name is Kiko. Thank you for the presentation. Could you talk about your plans once the token, the secondary market? Just maybe in general, and is there going to be any liquidity providers? So I'm trying to figure out how that's going to happen.
Yeah. So the question is, will there be a secondary market for the BB1 token, and will there be some form of a liquidity provider? So this is probably the part around the token offering that we have spent the most time with over the past months. And when I was presenting the ecosystem with the exchanges, I just scratched the surface of kind of the challenges that this space currently has. We've spoken to a lot of exchanges, and we're talking to them about a potential listing of the BB1 token. And nearly all exchanges that we spoke with were interested and were saying, yeah, we want to list that. It's a great project. It's the first security token out of Germany. And we've actually signed agreements with 2 centralized exchanges, relatively big ones, that are crypto exchanges. And one of these 2 exchanges is currently applying for what's called an MTF license. MTF stands for Multilateral Trading Facility. That's what you would commonly understand under the term exchange. And the other one is an exchange that operates as an asset broker. And Both of these exchanges cannot make a public announcement about the listing yet because they need to wait until they actually have the regulatory approval. But these two exchanges will list the BB1 token, but we can't predict at this point how long it will take them to finish their regulatory setup. This could be in 3 to 4 weeks from now, but it could also be 3 to 4 months from now. And that's the reason why we could not make an announcement yet, because obviously investors are taking all the information that we share publicly and use it in their investment decision, right? And so if we were to make an announcement now that at some unspecified point in the future we will make that listing, then people could say, well, I made the investment decision based on the fact that you said, well, in the next couple of weeks you're going to list. Then the listing didn't happen, I actually wouldn't have done that investment, right? That's the good and the bad thing about issuing a real security, because on the one hand there's real liability on side of the issuer. On the other hand, you have to be really careful with what you communicate to the public. If you look back to the ICO world, which I actually didn't even talk about today, a lot of ICO issuers were promising, to put it mildly, a lot of things that they never kept. However, you could not hold them liable for it because those was just cheap marketing talk, if you will, right? But there's no legal recourse as to hold them accountable for that. In case of a real security, you can hold us accountable. The managing directors of the issuer entity are actually personally liable if there is misinformation of the public, and therefore we are very careful with the announcements that we're making around exchanges. Then there is another important aspect, and that's the decentralized exchange. Because what people and what investors in the token can do is the moment we distribute the tokens to investors, they can trade it on the Stellar decentralized exchange. However, there's one caveat: the liquidity on that exchange is smaller than the exchanges that we're going to list with. The exchanges that we're going to list with, one of them has more than 500,000 customers, and the other has also customers in the hundreds of thousands. And so if they list a new asset, and the number of assets that they have listed today is relatively limited, there's a high chance that the investors and the traders that are already on these platforms will also be trading the BB1 token. While with the decentralized exchange, which has a daily trading volume of just a couple $100,000, probably the trading volume in the BB1 token won't be so big. Unless, I mean, up to today we have already over 1,200 investors in the BB1 token, which is a pretty substantial number. Probably there will be some trading going on. If you look at the decentralized exchange, you see some assets which have a very low market cap, like I'm talking just a couple of €1,000 that are being traded by, I don't know, 20, 30 people a day, which is actually not so small. So again, I don't want to sell too hard on the decentralized exchange part, because I don't want people to make an investment decision based on that. It's very likely that there will be some trading volume. If you invest, I don't know, €1,000 in the BB1 token, then it's relatively likely that you will be able to liquidate that investment if you want to do so in a relatively reasonable amount of time. If you invest €100,000 in the BB1 token, which some investors actually have done, the likelihood that you will be able to liquidate that investment on a decentralized exchange is rather small. And that brings us to the other topic that you mentioned, and that's market makers and liquidity providers. Since there are no exchanges yet, we also haven't signed an agreement with a market maker. We have spoken to a few market makers, and what we will probably do is that once we have an exchange listing, we'll probably also sign on a market maker. But these are things that essentially have the same challenges as we have with the exchanges, because there are market makers that provide liquidity to cryptocurrency markets, but most of the time they're not registered broker-dealers, which they would need to be if they want to trade securities. And then you've got registered broker-dealers that provide liquidity to certain securities markets, but that don't really have the expertise and the knowledge to provide liquidity to a security token, right? So in summary, it's extremely early days for that space. Probably in a year from now we will be a lot further. Probably in a year from now the BB1 token will be listed on 2, maybe even 3 centralized exchanges that have a lot of liquidity. There's a good chance that we will have a market maker to that, and if you run a security token offering in a year from now, then all of these things will be a lot easier because the ecosystem has taken a big step forward. But as of today, what I can say is there are exchanges that will list. We cannot determine the point in time, and there's a decentralized exchange that will very likely will have some liquidity, but it's hard to predict what will be the actual level of the liquidity.
Right, thank you.
You've been a pioneer by providing the first security token in the German space, which is like basically incredible. And the question that I have is what the feedback is from the crypto market and also the non-crypto market. Because right now you can sell to accredited investors, to retail investors. I would like to understand whether the appetite comes rather from the traditional world or from the crypto world, because you get a lot of press coverage in both spheres.
Yeah, so very good question. And in short, it's did the BB1 token offering so far appeal mainly to conventional investors or to investors from the crypto space, or potentially both? We've asked ourselves the same question, and you only know after the fact, but a few weeks into the token offering, which we launched on the 11th of March, we started to ask the investors that were already there. And interestingly, it turned out that we are addressing a very specific type of investor, or a very specific type of investor feels that our offering is compelling to them. First of all, it's relatively sophisticated retail investors. So it's retail investors who have a good understanding about how to manage their finances, their wealth. They can differentiate between a bond offering and an equity product and other types of assets. Plus, over 90% of them have previously invested in some form into some kind of crypto-related assets. So they have either invested in Bitcoin, Ether, or some of the other cryptocurrencies, or they have participated in some of the ICOs that were ongoing over the last 2 to 3 years. And so these are the investors that are investing in the BB1 token. What we didn't manage to reach were institutional investors. We've spoken to a good number of institutional investors. Most of them had these types of excuses, saying, well, in general, we are super excited about the technology, we like the offering, however, we are a bit afraid of the format, the new technology that it comes with, and we feel like it's a little bit too early to invest in that. Which on the other hand is normal, because institutional investors tend to be more conservative, and you don't have these early adopters like you would have with a retail investor. I mean, the minimum investment into the BB1 token is €1, and we have easily, I don't know, probably we have 100 or 200 investors who just invested €1. Only because they wanted to be part of that, they wanted to see the look and feel as a first-hand experience, but didn't put I would say, substantial amount of money into that. And then we also have investors that, so far we raised over 2 million, which is a decent amount. And so there are some investors that put bigger amounts of money into that, and those are investors who have a very deep understanding of what they are actually doing there. If you look at the crypto investors, for a lot of crypto investors, the return that we're offering here, which the expected yield is around about 7%, which in the fixed income space is a relatively high yield, they found that this is actually low compared to what a lot of ICOs were promising, right? If you invested in ICOs, it was most of the time all or nothing. Either you made 100x or the thing became totally worthless, right? And so some crypto investors like that type of risk and return profile, right? And many of them don't take an approach like these sophisticated investors, I would say, that we have in the offering take, where they say, well, I need a couple of assets in my portfolio that are high risk and high return, and I need a couple of assets in my portfolio that have a relatively stable return, where it's impossible that I make 100x on them, but where the probability that I lose my initial investment is really, really small, right? I think this is going to change going forward, especially on the institutional investor side. I think retail investors, early adopters are already in there today, and then normally if you see early adopters in a space, then if you have this typical curve where you have people who are following them, and then this over the next 2 to 3 years, I'm pretty confident that a lot of retail investors at some point will hold security tokens. The one company that we're supporting with their STO right now, for example, they are tokenizing real estate investments, probably some of the most conservative and most, I would say, established types of investments that you can have. And I'm sure that they will find a lot of retail investors just within the German market, because the types of real estate that they are offering is something that everybody can relate to, and I think at some point people will stop thinking about the technology that is making that investment possible, and will go back to actually think about the actual investment. With institutional investors, it's probably going to stay more difficult, at least over the next couple of maybe 2 to 3 years, because for them to make that change, to invest, even if it's the same type of asset that they used to invest in, but doing that through a new technology, through a new type of format, will probably take some time of adoption. I'm very certain it's going to happen ultimately, but it's hard to predict whether it's going to take 2, 3 years or 5 years or even more until a lot of the investment volume that institutional investors have will be switched through these technologies.
What's the value for an institutional investor to an STO versus the old-fashioned way?
So the question is, what's the value to an institutional investor? So if we're looking at the issuer, there are 2 aspects that are probably the most important ones. The first aspect is the transferability and the fungibility of the token. If you issue a conventional security, then unless you list it on one of the bigger exchanges, the fungibility is actually relatively limited. We've spoken to a bank, for example, which helps with mid-cap security issuances that in many cases are not exchange listed, but that are just being privately held. And there's a lot of problems in transferring the ownership in those securities, even across borders within the EU. Simply because the IT systems are incompatible, you normally need to involve multiple banks, and ultimately you can make it work always, but it's just a cumbersome and lengthy process that takes multiple days or weeks. So the fungibility aspect is something that may not be important to every issuer, but there is definitely a good number of issuers which appreciate the fact that you increase the transferability and the ease of transferability. And the second point is cost, because you save costs for all the intermediaries that are involved in the settlement process. If you look at a corporate bond issue of 200, 300 million, then these settlement and infrastructure costs are relatively low, so it's not like you have huge percentage gains in costs, but at the end of the day, still, it is a cost that you can eliminate, and I would say the main cost that you eliminate is not even the money that you pay to these intermediaries, because percentage-wise, they make up relatively small percentages of the total issue, but you reduce the complexity cost, which is not always so easy to monetize. But if you need to involve 2 or 3 intermediaries in the process, and you can just cut them out, and you don't need to coordinate with them, you don't need to set up agreements with them, then it's not just the money that you save on the fees that you are paying these intermediaries, but you also reduce the complexity, which in many cases can speed up the process. And then again, we're not just talking about money that's easy to measure, but we're talking about reduced complexity and faster processes, which in many cases can mean real money, but that are not so easy to pinpoint how much we're actually talking about.
Do you see Facebook's Libra affecting you in any way?
Hard to say whether Facebook's Libra affected us. My personal assumption is the Bitcoin price went up quite significantly over the last 1 to 2 months, and it would be hard to ignore the fact that Libra has been announced, and it surely had an impact on the cryptocurrency prices. And that in turn has a probably indirect effect on our security token offering, because as I mentioned, we do have a lot of investors who have previous cryptocurrency experience, and probably these investors are more likely to invest some of their cryptocurrency gains into a new type of asset than if we were in a market where cryptocurrency prices are coming down. So I don't think there was a direct effect on our token offering, but if you look at it from a bigger scope, there probably was some effect, and I would rather say it's positive, because again, some of the cryptocurrency gains that we've seen over the last few months were probably to a certain degree related to the announcements of Libra.
Thanks for wanting to talk again. I have 2 questions. My
just build upon the very first question which was asked regarding exchanges. So let's take the example of StellarX or another decentralized exchange. If I would buy your token there after this event has finished, do I have to register with you through KYC to then receive the 4% on an ongoing basis? Or how would that come to me if I'm a decentralized exchange buyer?
Yeah.
That's question number one.
Yeah.
Question two is connected to that. Like, generally, do I receive my coupon or interest per year through a specified form from my side, or is that cash or a particular token which you say will be delivered?
Yeah, very good questions. So first question, if you buy the BB1 token in the secondary market, do you need to register with Bitbond as the issuer? And then the second question is, how do you receive the interest and the coupon payments? So the first question, the short answer is no. You don't need to register with us as the issuer. If you go and buy the BB1 token on the Stellar decentralized exchange after the token offering is over, you can simply buy it and you will be holding it. And through the Stellar blockchain, we can see at any given point in time who holds BB1 tokens. So this is publicly accessible information. If you buy it in the secondary market, we won't know your identity. We won't know that it's you who is behind a particular Stellar address, because again, we don't require secondary market buyers to register with us. However, we will always see the Stellar addresses. And so what's happening on the 1st of October, there will be the first coupon payment date. And so what we will literally do is we will download a list of all the Stellar addresses that are holding BB1 tokens. We will see the amount of BB1 tokens that each of these Stellar addresses is holding. And then we will be paying out pro rata the coupon payments to all of these addresses. And the great thing for the investors is they don't need to do anything. They just need to hold the token. That's all they need to do. And this is also a big advantage compared to, where are we? This thing here, right? Because here you need to tear off the piece of paper and go to the bank and ask them, please pay out the coupon, and hoping that the bank has enough liquidity, right? And in our case, you don't need to do anything, and you just receive the interest into your wallet. Now, how does that happen? So what we have decided for is that we pay out the interest payment in Stellar Lumens, which is the native cryptocurrency on top of the Stellar blockchain. The beautiful thing about that is that there are no further technical restrictions. If you hold a BB1 token in a Stellar address, it automatically means that it's an active Stellar address, and you can always receive Stellar Lumens into it. And you receive the euro equivalent value of the interest that we're paying out. There's a small downside to it, and that's if you don't want to hold Stellar Lumens, you will need to go to an exchange and convert into dollars, into euros, or whatever. However, what you can do, since there is a euro token on the Stellar decentralized exchange, you could immediately after you receive the interest payment, and you know exactly when you will receive it because the date is specified in the prospectus, you can immediately go and convert it into euro tokens if you want to hold a stable coin, right? What we could have done is we could have said we are paying out the coupon payments in the stablecoin directly, right? And there's a good chance that going forward, this is how coupon payments will function. However, there's one small downside to it, and that's in Stellar, there's a concept that's called a trust line. If you want to receive a asset that's issued on top of the Stellar blockchain, you need to make a certain setting in your wallet where you say, I and my wallet wants to receive assets from this particular issuer. Now, if we distributed the tokens, they were traded in the secondary market, and someone bought the token under the assumption that only holding the token is enough to receive the interest payments. And they didn't learn about the fact that they need to set up a trust line for the euro tokens. Then they would be blocked from receiving the interest, right? And that's the only downside there is if you do it that way, and therefore we decided not to do it that way. However, I believe if euro tokens and other stable coins on top of Stellar will become more common and will become more popular, then for future issuances it's very likely that they will function in a way that actually stable coins will be paid out instead of Stellar Lumens.
Great, thank you.
Christoph.
I'm just wondering, how are you calculating the 60%, the yield on the 60%? Is it a certain bunch of loans being pegged to your issuance volume, or how do you track and
Okay, so
calculate?
yeah, also a very good question. The question is, how do we calculate the 60% profit that we pay out as a variable coupon to the token holders? So we've actually simplified it, because since the issuer is its own legal entity, it's a GmbH, a private limited company. What we simply do, we'll finish the financial statements of the fiscal year, and once they are finished, it will be clear what was the pre-tax profit for the previous year, and we simply take the pre-tax profit of the issuer company, and 60% of that is what will be paid out to the token holders. So it's actually relatively simple. And since this company doesn't have a lot of operational costs, I mean, we have costs now in the initial year in order to run the issuance, but for all following years, the only cost that's really in that company is to keep the company alive with the bookkeeping and tax declarations that the company needs to do. But other than that, there are no operational costs in that company, apart from the 4% fixed coupon, right? So that's actually the main operational cost that the company has. And so what we're saying is that the target return in the SME loans portfolio that we're investing in is around about 8 to 10%. And so we assume, so let's assume it was 10% to keep the example simple. And let's assuming there were no operational costs. Then we're making 10% in return. We're paying 4% as the coupon, which leaves us with 6% excess return. And 60% of 6% is 3.6. So it's a simplified example, but just to get the mechanics behind it. So that would mean on top of the 4%, there would be 3.6% variable coupon as an excess return.
Okay, so that means that you get an issuance volume. Once you've invested that, you close books, and then the SPV kind of runs.
Exactly. Although we already started to invest, right? So we are running the token offering since the 11th of March, and the proceeds that have already come in, we've already started to invest. And we do that because on the 1st of October, we have the first due date of the first coupon payment, right? So we better earn that interest so we don't make a loss on the coupon payments that we have to do.
Okay, last question. What does it mean out of the tax perspective for the holder of the status?
So yeah, so what is the tax perspective? So by German law, we are required to pay out the interest after withholding tax. So that's Abgeltungssteuer in German. And so that's what we do. So we pay the withholding tax to the tax authorities in Germany and pay out net of tax. If your tax domicile is not Germany, we give you a tax kind of certificate, and then foreign investors can reclaim the tax from the German tax office.
One question that resulted from all the others. So you say you have an issuer company, and the issuer company then kind of lends the money. So it's Bitbond, right? So it's a liquidation waterfall, it's a bond instrument, so it's above equity. And now you're lending this money to the operational company. And what in the liquidation waterfall? Is it still a bond, or where is it in the liquidation?
No, it's still a bond, although we lend most of that to the SMEs, right? We lend directly to the SMEs because the issuer company, it's called Bitbond Finance GmbH, is just another investor on the Bitbond platform that invests into SME loans.
Okay, so in case of liquidation or default, but in case it happens from the liquidation waterfall, where are those guys who invest in there? Are they above the equity holders? Is it like something like a subordinated debt?
Yeah, they're above the equity holders, yeah.
So it's a subordinated debt?
But it's the equity is relatively small anyway, right? Because it's just a GmbH, so the equity is relatively small anyway. The equity takes the first hit, right? Because the equity holders don't get anything, well, unless there was so much substance on the assets, right? But it wouldn't go insolvent if that wasn't the case, right? So the equity holders take the first hit, and then what would happen is that the SME loans portfolio that was invested in would get liquidated over time. And that would take up to a year, because the maximum term of the loans that we hand out is 12 months, right? So within 12 months, the whole portfolio would be liquidated, and whatever comes back from that would be disbursed to the token holders. So that's what would happen in case of an insolvency.
So
So prior to the STO, you built a network, international network of trusted third parties that accept Stellar and do the payouts to the STEs. Is that correct?
On the Bitbond platform, we work with Stellar as a platform for payments, and we work together with payment processors, the main one being Tempo, a French payment processor, which is a regulated payment service provider from France. And what they do is that they are the issuer of the Euro token that we're using on the Bitbond platform, because on the Bitbond platform, we're not using cryptocurrencies, at least for most of the transaction volume. We're not using volatile cryptocurrencies, but we're using the Euro token that is issued by Tempo. And so if you're a borrower and you apply for a loan through our platform, then in the back end, the payments through the Bitbond platform go via the Euro token, but then ultimately the Euro token is transferred to Tempo, to the issuer of the Euro token, and they will pay out the euros to your bank account if you wish so. If you wish, you could also get the Euro tokens, but most of the time the borrowers simply want to have the money arrive in their bank account.
Okay, so Tempo has the network globally as well to make sure that in Africa, for example, there will be business.
Yes, so it's essentially you need other on and off ramps, as it's called, that on the one hand accept Euro tokens that are issued by Tempo, and that on the other hand are willing to pay out local currency for that. In Kenya, for example, where we have a partnership with one of the biggest African e-commerce companies, in Kenya there's a company that's called Flutterwave. They are formally not related to Tempo on a shareholder level. However, they know Tempo and they trust them as a Euro token issuer, and so they are willing to accept Euro tokens as a payment method that are issued by Tempo.
One last question, right? So I think there is at least 129 companies that wonder how you did it, right? And you said you're going to do some white labeling in terms of the STO, for example, some help and assistance. Number one, how would you, for example, you decided to do this in Germany, right? What would you say to other STOs? What are the advantages of doing this in Germany? How difficult is it?
So, what are the advantages to do an STO in Germany? A year back, this question would have been a lot harder to answer, because a lot of people were saying, well, probably it's easier to do that in Luxembourg and Malta and Gibraltar, so some jurisdictions that have maybe not as strict regulatory frameworks. However, one of the reasons why back then we decided to run it in Germany was that we felt like the German regulator is already relatively advanced in their thinking about tokenization, about cryptocurrencies. BaFin has been the first regulator worldwide probably to publicly issue a statement as to how they treat cryptocurrencies from a regulatory standpoint. In 2011, they issued a paper which classified cryptocurrencies as financial instruments, very similar to FX, so to foreign currency, but not securities. So they have already gone through a pretty comprehensive thinking process, and the conversations that we had with BaFin encouraged us to do the offering in Germany, because we felt like the regulator has already an advanced understanding of the technology. Today, I would definitely say Germany is one of the best jurisdictions, at least within the EU, to do a token offering, because especially if it's a bond offering, you can more or less copy and paste our prospectus. I mean, that's publicly accessible information. Prospectuses are open source, if you will. Of course, you will need to adjust all the descriptions around the offer, around the risks and everything, but the underlying legal framework, you can literally copy and paste, and it has a very high likelihood to be approved. I mean, securities prospectuses, if you file them with the regulator in Germany, the regulator has to give you feedback on a prospectus filing within 20 business days. Even though the German regulator has a name for being relatively slow, the whole securities issuance is legally defined. What are the deadlines? And they do stick to it. I mean, issuing a securities prospectus in Germany is an efficient process. There's no doubt about that. And if you go a very similar way compared to what we have done, probably it will be faster with BaFin than with any other regulator in the EU. So today there's a lot of really good reasons actually to issue, tokenized securities in Germany. Good. I think it's 6:45. Wow, the time has progressed really quickly. I would say we wrap it up. Bitbond team members and myself will still be around. There's still a couple of drinks. So if there are further, more detailed questions, we're very happy to take them. And otherwise, again, thank you so much for coming and joining us today.